Resume recording. And I'm going to reshare my screen. And start our program here. Okay. I also do, just a note, housekeeping note here, I do have some video clips in this program, and I know sometimes they can kind of be herky-jerky on other people's ends. So again, if you stop your video connection, you may get a stronger internet connection overall, and hopefully those videos will play a little bit more smoothly for you. But like I said, I will be recording this, and it will be on our YouTube channel. So if for some reason things aren't exactly as clear as you'd like them to be tonight, you will have the opportunity to go back and see them again. We are a relatively small group here tonight right now. When I ask questions, I'm going to say it's fine to unmute yourself and ask questions out loud when I stop if you want. If you don't want to, because we're recording, feel free to enter them into the chat box, and I have a couple times throughout the program that I'll stop tonight to answer questions. So with that, we will get started. So here we're going to talk about the dance of the Timberdoodle, and otherwise known as the American Woodcock. And we'll talk about some biology of the birds, as well as the fancy mating dance that the males do. So, but before we get to that, I just want to take a moment to talk about who we are for those who are on the call tonight who might not be familiar with us. Wissahickon Trails is an environmental nonprofit based in Ambler, Pennsylvania. Been around for a little over 60 years. We were founded by a group of concerned citizens to protect the land and water of the upper Wissahickon Creek. And we mainly operate in Montgomery County. We work with our partners in Philadelphia County, since the Wissahickon does run through Philadelphia on its way to the Schuylkill River. To date, we have protected nearly 1,300 acres of land from development. You can see on the map here, all these green areas, dark green areas are areas that we have protected. And on that protected land are 12 nature preserves and 24 miles of trails that are open to you, the public. And we invite you to come out and enjoy them, see what's out there and explore if you don't already do that. Since we are a nonprofit, we do rely on the financial support of our supporters. If you are a current supporter of ours and you're on the call tonight, I personally offer my thanks. We couldn't do this without you, and your support is greatly appreciated. If you're not currently a supporter, I encourage you to take a look at our website and get some more details on the work that we do, and maybe, you know, take a chance to become a supporter of ours and help us to continue our work and the mission that we're trying to achieve. With that, I'm going to jump into a quick overview of the plan for the evening. I'm going to spend the first part of the program talking about the natural history of the woodcock, and then really talk about the fancy breeding male aerial display that they do, which is one of the easiest ways actually to kind of encounter a woodcock in the field. I'm going to talk some about our Woodcock Citizen Science Project, and then at the end talk about some woodcock walks that we have. And I have walks in quotes because we don't actually have to walk very far. So it's more of an observational opportunity, but there are some available to folks, so that hopefully you can come out and hear and maybe see a woodcock in person. So with that, I'm going to jump in. This is an American woodcock. And the American woodcock is known by a whole lot of different names that you can see here. And all of these names kind of speak to sort of the uniqueness of the woodcock as a bird. It's not the kind of bird that we tend to see all the time, for sure. And it's got some really unique habitat requirements. And so things like Timberdoodle, timber meaning woods, and doodle probably came about because doodle used to be sort of a slang word for odd or funny. And this bird sort of definitely fits that bill. The bog sucker, again, speaks to sort of its habitat. Night partridge, it's mainly active at night, unlike most other birds that we have. Big eyes, well, you can see it kind of does have big eyes. And the forest dwelling shorebird is, sort of the most descriptive, and that's exactly what this bird is. So when we talk about identification, woodcocks are part of this sort of large group of birds that are lumped together as shorebirds. And in fact, most of these birds are actually found fairly close to water most of the time. There's only a few species that aren't routinely found very close to water, and the woodcock is one of them. But most of them are found on beaches, in swamps, marshes, those kinds of areas. And you can see here, if you're not a birder, these may not be familiar birds to you, but they all kind of have these shades of brown, grays, some black thrown in there. Some of them, if you are a birder, you know that there can be some very confusing species among the shorebirds. And thankfully, in some respects, the woodcock really isn't one of those, mostly because of its unique habitat, but also because of what it looks like. So if we put our woodcock back up here, again, it's in the snow on what kind of looks like leaves and pine needles, not at the beach for sure. The closest shorebird to a woodcock that could sometimes be confused with that is the Wilson snipe, which I just put up here down at the bottom. And so we're going to kind of compare these two because these are the most often frequently confused birds, just because of where the snipe can sometimes be found in marshy areas that might look like areas that a woodcock would inhabit. So one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is that snipe, which is where my cursor is now, have stripes on the top of their head. And it's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see the white edge here. And then there's a black stripe and then the brown stripe by the eye. In contrast, the woodcock on the right here has stripes that go across the head. So more like bars across its head, not stripes that go with the head. And that's probably the big identification feature. The other is this red, sort of rusty red kind of feathers underneath. Snipe tend to be more barred, black and white, striped, if you will, like this, where the woodcock is much more of a sort of mellowy, buffy red kind of color. They both have long bills, they both have short legs, they both kind of have this rotund sort of, they kind of look like almost like a half a football sort of with a head stuck on them. I mean, they're kind of a unique shape for birds. And they're both kind of very distinctive when they fly because of those shapes. They look very similar when they're in the air. And actually the snipe has a display call similar to what the woodcock has, but they just do them in very, very different areas. Woodcocks always need woods, and the snipe is going to be more in an open, marshy area, not in the woods. So a couple of different ways to tell them apart. Again, you can see, the woodcock just has this really unique kind of shape to it. So if we talk about their range, in our area of Pennsylvania, they're really here in the spring and the summer. The yellow here, spring and summer, so that's where they breed. Year-round, areas of southern New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, they can definitely be there all year round. In fact, one kind of decent place to sometimes see woodcock out in the open is down along the Delaware Bay shore down into Cape May, especially after the area's had a couple really hard freezes. You'll see when we talk about their eating habits, they need soft ground to be able to probe with their bills. And when an area has a lot of hard freezes, they tend to come out towards the edges of roads where things are not as frozen in the winter, which can be detrimental to the birds, but it can also offer careful viewing opportunities to actually see them out in the open. And in Pennsylvania, they actually are a breeding bird for sure. All these red dots, I know this seems really wildly out of date, but this is the last time that the Pennsylvania Breeding Bird Atlas was actually completed, was in 2009. And all these big red dots are where there were confirmed breeders, and then you can see the smaller dots are probable and the even smaller dots are possible. And here in Montgomery County, we had some confirmed breeders and some probable breeders as well. So they are in our area. You can see they're definitely more common up in the northwestern corner of the state, but they are here. And possibly probably breeding in our area. This is actually something that we're trying to confirm with our community science projects. And so we'll talk about that towards the end of the program. Typically, we tend to see them more on migration than we do during breeding, and we'll talk about that as well. One unique feature of woodcock is that they have what's called a prehensile bill. So you can kind of see that this bill sort of has this upward curve to it, and this allows the woodcock to stick their beak all the way into the ground and actually open it while it's in the ground. They can control that very tip of their bill and actually open it while it's buried in the dirt. And the reason that they need to be able to do this is because 75% of their diet is earthworms. And so they're in sort of damp, wet, woodland areas, probing in the soil for worms. And they'll eat other invertebrate insects and snails and spiders, millipedes, things like that as well. But worms are definitely the bulk of their diet. So this gives them the ability to easily get them while the worms are still underground. And so this next slide, I have a video here of a feeding woodcock. And you'll notice that they do this characteristic bob up and down. The best theory for this is that it helps send vibrations into the ground that makes the earthworms move so that they can find them. It's the best explanation I've heard. I'm not sure anybody's really positive why they do this, but they do. And you'll notice also that the bird catches a small worm that it doesn't actually eat. And I think it may be because, I'm not sure, this is not my video, but I noticed the snow on the ground. So it's possible that the worm is actually sort of frozen or dead, and the bird just doesn't actually even realize it's an earthworm. So here we go. There's that bob. You can see its bill way down in there. So there you go. That's what they look like out in the open when they're feeding, which is honestly not the way most of us ever get to see these birds, I'll be honest. But it is sometimes possible. So, and young birds even actually start doing that bob very, very quickly after they're hatched. So it's a very unique woodcock thing. So, whoops, I'll go to the next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit here about the habitats that they need. And they actually need a couple of different kinds of habitats. So the woodcocks require open areas, so open fields, woodland edges, with some space overhead for the male displays, and also for roosting. They tend to roost out sort of in the open a little bit. And then for their feeding areas and the nesting and where the female birds raise their young, they need relatively young forests. They like forests that are kind of open. They need to be damp, not in really dry areas, because that just makes it too hard for them to feed. So areas that have some wetness, have some small shrubs, small trees, you know, shady areas, protection, that kind of thing. When a forest gets to be on the much older side, and this indicates here, you know, more than 30 years or so, they tend not to use that very much. And mostly that's because these areas of small shrubs and sort of more areas of cover tend to disappear when you have a mature forest. You have very big trees, you have a closed canopy, and there's not a lot of stuff growing underneath of it. So they tend to like edges, and they tend to like younger growing things. But they will use older areas if there's edge habitat that they can use and enough of it. And so you can see this is some pictures from our Crossways Preserve, and we tend to have a bunch of the habitat that they would use for breeding, for all of these things actually, for male displays and roosting in the open fields and edges along the woods. And then we have wet woodlands in a lot of our areas. Most of the protected area that we have came about because we're trying to protect either the creek itself, and so the immediate areas that drain into the creek, which tend to be wet a lot of the time throughout the year, or areas like Crossways, which are a little bit further away from the actual creek, but they're sort of an important catchment, if you will, for water in that area to sort of funnel it into some small tributaries down to the creek. So these woods where you can see here all the green, this is actually very wet. So this parts of Crossways tend to stay wet for most of the year. Now, one thing that we are lacking is some of this shrubby area, and you can see some along the edges here, and our edges kind of have a lot of that cover. We tend to have more mature forest in the middle. A lot of that is probably around 30 plus years old. Some of it may be a little bit older, depending on the actual part of the preserve that you're in. But one of the things that we're trying to do through our management plans, and because woodcocks are important to us, is see how we can sort of soften the edges from the woods into these fields areas to add some of these smaller trees, lower shrubby areas for cover that might be areas that woodcock would use for breeding. So when we talk about their nesting and their young, woodcocks lay all their eggs on the ground. They sort of hollow out a little cup right on the ground and lay their eggs. They usually lay about 4 eggs. Only the mother incubates the eggs. The males don't have anything to do with it, with anything to do with nest selection or making or taking care of the eggs or the young. The eggs can be laid as early as April 1st. And if they are, they would hatch by the end of April, but they can be laid, into the early summer as well. And the further north you move, the sort of later they will be. So we could have birds that have hatched in our area by the end of April. The young are born pre-cocal, which means they're kind of like a chicken. They come out of the egg and they're ready to go. They're not like a robin that needs the mom to sit on them and continue to feed them in the nest until they grow all their feathers. They come out with all their downy feathers ready to go, and within a couple of hours, maybe a day, once they dry off, they're gone and they leave the nest and they don't come back. They'll stay with the mom for about a month or so, and she starts feeding them right away, but they will actually start probing for their own food when they're only about 3 or 4 days old. So, they know what to do, and they're well equipped to do it. Obviously, their bill needs to grow a little bit, but, proportionally for the size of the baby, it's right there, and it will continue to grow as they grow as well. So they're ready to go. They come off the nest, and by about a month old, they're doing their thing on their own. And these birds, as you can see from these pictures and then also these pictures, they are cryptic birds in their proper habitat, and they can be difficult to see. And this is one of the things that makes them really difficult to see, this cryptic habitat. And unless they're actively feeding and doing that bob and pushing their bill into the ground and moving their head, they kind of just sit there. And so that's another reason why they're difficult to see. And these birds really, really, really have a habit of absolutely sitting still until you are literally right on top of them. So when we had a work day at our Crossways Preserve, very early spring, one year, there was an area that we were piling brush that we were moving. We were removing some invasive species and we were making a brush pile out of it. And we had been piling stuff there, probably for the better part of an hour. And because the pile started to get full, we moved just a bit to the left. And one of my colleagues took a step into sort of an area that had a little shrub, and a woodcock just blasted out from right underneath of it and flew away from us. And so oftentimes how most of us will encounter woodcock if we see them in the woods is flying away from us at a very rapid speed. And they really just sort of wait until you get right on top of them, and then they'll take off. And so again, something that makes them much more difficult to see than other species of birds. And so the best time to actually see them, which is actually hear them, is during the male's display flight, which we're going to talk about next. So I'm going to stop real quick and see if anybody has any questions so far about sort of woodcocks in general before we launch into the. I don't see any questions popped into the chat.
Yeah,
So if you think of anything.
You said something like pre-cloacal or something like that.
Yeah, that just means they're ready to go. It's the same way that chickens are born. So they have feathers. They don't need to spend time in the nest, you know, continuing their development. So if we think of robins, for example, they're born without any feathers, really. They're naked little birds, and the mom has to sit there and keep them warm for weeks until their feathers grow in and they're capable of flight. And woodcocks, that's not the case. They can run around within hours of coming out of the egg. As soon as they're dry, they're good to go. They can't fly yet. They don't have flight feathers. They can only run on the ground, but they don't need to be developed any further in the nest. And that term, the pre-cloacal, just is a term of, you know, ready to go.
Fascinating.
Drawing a complete blank of what the other term is that we would use for robins, to be honest with you. Okay, so somebody chatted in a question, do we know the health of the populations in Pennsylvania? I don't actually, and mostly because they haven't really done another breeding bird survey. I try to look at sort of eBird as a guide, and if you are using eBird, it shows you that they're being reported for sure. The problem with using eBird is that you can have birds that are old, so you kind of have to look at each individual hotspot. It's hard to see the picture as a whole, but they're there. They're doing okay, I think. They do have a couple particular threats to them. So one, interestingly enough, is that they are still a game bird, so they can be hunted in some areas, and some places they're actually raised and released for hunting purposes. Not so much in our area, I don't think anymore, but parts of Pennsylvania. And that actually may help some of those natural populations, because some of those birds are going to survive in the wild and continue to carry on. The other thing is the migrating populations of the woodcocks are actually one that have a tendency to hit windows. So particularly in foggy or rainy weather, when they're flying over cities like Philadelphia or New York, they are ones, for some, nobody really knows why, but some species tend to be ones that have window collisions much more often, and woodcock are often one of those species. And so a lot of cities, Philadelphia included now, have campaigns for lights out during migration, and they're using data from eBird that shows when migration levels should be high for a given night, and they put out the word and they ask high rises to put their lights out so that the birds can't see it, and they're less likely to hit windows and be drawn into the city, particularly if the weather's bad. So overall, I think they're not as threatened as, say, wood thrushes or some of our wood warbler species, but they probably are still declining overall. And again, a lot of that decline probably has to do with habitat loss as well. So I don't see any other questions here, so I will move on to the aerial display, or dance as it's sometimes called. And since most of it takes place in the air, again, we're going to put dance in quotes because most of it's not actually on the ground. So The aerial display has two parts. Well, let's start with, okay, so why they do this. It is used to attract a female for mating, and that is really the only time of the year that they do it. So it's a very specific period of the year, and males typically will not do it for the rest of the year. One male may mate with several females, and as we said earlier, the male plays no role in the nest site selection, incubating, or raising the young. So they have a role to play. They attract a female. They're making little babies, but that's all they're doing. And so they tend to not protect a territory like other birds would do. And so attracting a female is something that they need to work very hard at during that breeding season. But then they're gone and on their way. And they may continue to move north to look for additional mates. They might hang out in an area with a lot of food for the rest of the summer until it's time to migrate in the fall. You know, they can move around a bit depending on if their nutritional needs are being met, that type of a thing. And because they're so cryptic and because they're so hard to find, it makes them difficult to track, honestly. And the migration season, when they're doing this display, or, you know, the mating season is usually how they're found. So for us, that's generally February to April in our specific area here. They usually do this display twice a day, at dawn and at dusk. I lived in an area that had breeding woodcock, and I know that I tended to hear them more at dusk than at dawn. They would do it at dawn for sure, but there would definitely more birds calling for longer at dusk. So if you wanted to try to go out and find them yourself in an area, I would highly recommend the dusk time. And we'll talk about when that actually is in a little bit. And each display has two parts. The first part we call the peint, and you'll see why in a second. And the second part is the flight. And they often go together, but sometimes birds will peint without doing a flight display. And if they're doing the flight part without the peint, you probably won't see them or hear them. The peint is really that thing that we're focusing for in the field. So it's called that because that's kind of what they sound like. So I have a video clip here, and this is a painting woodcock. And this sound is usually given in a clear area. It will turn in a circle, so it tends to do the paint at least 4 times, one in each direction, so north, south, east, west. I don't know that there's a specific direction that it needs to start. It just almost always goes in a circle. And you can often hear that when you're in the field, because it'll be really loud, and then it'll be a little quieter, and then it'll be really quiet because the bird's facing completely away from you. Then it'll be louder, and it might do a 5th one facing back at you. And so that one's really loud. And so you can actually hear it turning in a circle, even if you can't see it. And what I will say when you're watching this video, also, you know, be listening to it, but watch the tip of its bill, because you can actually see a little bit of that flexibility that it has when it's opening its bill to make the noise. That's it. That's the peint. And it's named the peint because that's kind of what it sounds like it's saying. The best description that we have for it. Now, this is a very vocal bird. And sometimes birds will be that way, particularly early in the evening. They may do a lot of painting from the ground before they actually start taking off to do the aerial flight. Once they're sort of in the flight part of their display, then they tend to sort of slow down on the paint. When they come back to the ground, they'll do it maybe 4 or 5 times, and then they'll take off again. And we're going to talk about the flight now. And so the flight is a really actually kind of complicated set of things that this bird actually does. So we're going to start here sort of in the middle between the words up and down. And this would be where the bird is flat on the ground doing its paint call. When it's done and ready to do the flight part of its display, it will launch itself up into the air, and it actually flies in this spiral, and it goes up in a spirally circle at the same time. So it's up and spiraled, and it will do these things that we call wing twitters, which I have a clip of. You can hear that, and I will explain what it does with that in a second. But it actually makes a lot of noise with its wings at that point as it's spiraling upward in the air. As the bird gets higher, the spirals get bigger, as you can see here, and it continues to do the wing twitters. At the top of the flight, which can be as high as 300 feet in the air, it will do several of these really large circles. And it will still do the wing twitters, but it also adds some vocal chirps in there that you can start to hear. Now, when the bird is way up high, the 300 feet, the recording that I have, you'll notice it gets really quiet at that point. It's harder to hear because it's far away from the microphone. And in person, that part of it's kind of hard to hear as well. Oftentimes, as it comes around kind of in a circle closer to where you might be standing, you can start to pick that up again. But it does get quiet here. But then at the end of those few large circles, it starts to come down, and it comes down in this really odd zigzag pattern. You can see here these like really flippy zigzags here. And while it's doing that, it's not really flying. It's actually sort of looks like it's falling back in this zigzag pattern. And it starts giving louder vocal chirps, which you can start to hear again as it comes down. And so it's a really unique kind of system. And considering that it happens at dusk, and most birds start to get really active about 20 minutes after sunset. So when they start the painting for the night and maybe the first early flights, there's some light in the air. I mean, you can still see them a lot of times when they first start taking off, but very rapidly we lose that light for us to be able to see. But you can still hear them. They're flying in the dark. Now, they don't fly all night. The display may go on for 30 minutes on a really good night. Clear skies, right temperatures, peak of that breeding season kind of thing. Maybe they might be displaying for about 45 minutes, max about an hour. So it's not like it happens all night, but it does get dark, and they are doing it in the dark. And so it's the sound that's really important. So those paints on the ground, and then the wing twitters and those vocal chirps. And it's really funny because last year when we did some of the walks at Crossways, we weren't hearing any males painting. And so I played a recording. Sometimes if they're out there and they're just not in the mood, or they haven't gotten a response from females, they might be quiet. And so let's see if I could get one to respond while we were out there. And we didn't get a male to respond, but a woodcock actually flew at us. And I actually think it was a female that thought we were a male painting from that location. And she kind of flew around us really quick for a minute, and I realized that there was no actual male woodcock there, and it was a bunch of people, and dove back into the high grass, and we never saw her again. So they're there for sure, and can respond in a variety of different ways, but that vocal part of this is the really important part. So I'm gonna hold on 1 second because I'm missing my link for the whole wing song. Let me stop sharing really quickly. Oh, sorry, my fault. I got my slides out of order. I actually do have what I'm looking for. Let me make this bigger again. Okay, so what makes the feather sound? Let's talk about that first before we hear the sound. So in woodcock, these 3 outer primary feathers are a different size. They're much smaller, they're much narrower, and they can actually, the sound of the air and the way they hold them in the air is what actually makes those sort of wing whirs as they're in the air with their wings. So they have a combination of things that they do with their vocal ability, the peent, and then the vocal twitters that they give on the way down, and then they make the wing sounds with these actual specialized feathers on their end of their wings. Most other birds, these outer primary feathers are going to be the same size as the rest of the feathers would be. And it doesn't appear to impact their flight, their ability to fly. They migrate pretty good distances, you know, so that's not really an issue, but it allows them to make this unique sound. So here's the sound, and as I said, so this particular bird, it's going to give 5 peats, and then it does this launch itself up into the air. So I'm going to play it once and just let you hear it. It's going to get quiet when it's up here, and then you'll be able to hear it come down. I'm going to play it once and just let you listen to it, and then I'll play it again and sort of talk through it that second time. Now it's back on the ground. So let me start this over. So we're going to hear 5 peents from a bird on the ground. It's going to launch. That sound that you hear is all from its wings, and that's doing this ever expanding spiral circle up. Now we kind of lose it. So it's up at the top here, starts to do these big circles. And now it's started down. And it's added the vocal chirps. Those are its wings, it's landing. And then it starts peaking again. And that is a cycle that it will do multiple times throughout the evening. in the hopes of attracting a female. And I mentioned weather a bit briefly, and they tend, so if it's raining, if it's really windy, if it's actively snowing, that kind of thing, they tend not to display. If it's kind of a little windy, they might do the paints on the ground, but they won't do the flight display. Because I think they recognize that they're competing with the wind, and it's hard to hold themselves steady in, you know, a high wind for sure. Rain does the same thing. Rain's going to drown out the sounds from when they're really up high, excuse me, and just not be a very productive night. So the most productive nights tend to be nights that are clear. Typically not a full moon, because there's too much light in the sky for them with a full moon. They want it dark. That's when they operate at their best. And then, so, you know, very limited wind, no rain, no snow, that kind of thing. Those are the nights that they tend to be most productive. But like I said, if they're around, they can often do the paint part of their call without the display, the flight display itself, and still try to attract a female that way when they're in the area. So before I launch into the community science project, does anybody have any questions about the flight display?
I have a question.
Sure.
So since this is mostly happening when it's pretty dark out, does that mean that they have pretty good night vision? Because the females, you know, obviously it's kind of directed at them, or is the sound more important?
They have decent night vision. The big eyes are going to really help them. Their eyes are a little bit more like owls, and they're very much light gathering eyes, which is also why they're not as active during the middle of the day as some other birds might be. They're going to tend to do their feeding sort of at the edges of the day because those big eyes are much more sensitive to light. But the vocal part of the display is also very important, because even if a female can see a male at night, she's got to know where he is. And it's hard for them. They're operating in woods, in scrubby areas. There might be some taller grass, so they're not going to sort of have those same sight lines, if you will. So that display just, you know, advertises, here I am. And attracts any females that might be in the area. Now, once he's back down on the ground, they can probably see each other way more easily than we can see them. Let's put it that way. But not unlike grouse, that you do those sort of booming calls on their leks, and it's, you know, sort of a community kind of area for display. That's often what happens with woodcocks as well. And sometimes there'll only be one male around displaying, but oftentimes there's more than one of them. And one starts calling, and you'll hear it, you know, sort of off to your left, and then another one will start to your right, and you can actually distinctly hear, you know, two different birds, because they're very much like painting at each other. And sometimes there's more than two as well. So that vocal part of it is really important. Okay. If any questions pop in your head, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we'll jump into the community science project here. So we have a whole lot of community science projects that we're working on as Wissahickon Trails. And the idea behind this is all of those 12 preserves that I mentioned, all the properties that we're managing, we have land management plans that are being written for all of them. And in order to know that we're carrying out parts of the land management plan, we need to be monitoring things that we might be having an impact on. So we're using community science projects as a way to engage folks from the community to help us monitor a variety of different species. I'm not going to talk about all of these here. And in fact, I'm giving a program a virtual program for the Ambler Library next Tuesday. That's free. So if you want to go sign up on the Ambler Library's website, you can get the Zoom link for that. And I'll talk about all these projects in more detail if that's of interest to you. But we're only going to talk about the woodcock call surveys tonight, since that's what we're talking about. So first I want to start off with the results to date. So we began this project in 2019, which is when pretty much most of our community science projects started. We started at our 4 properties that we felt like had the potential to have woodcocks utilizing them. Armand Trout, Crossways, Dodsworth Run, and Willow Lake. And this was a protocol that was based on a Fish and Wildlife survey that used to be done for woodcocks. I think they ran this survey for 10 or 15 years, and they ran it for a long time. It's no longer running, but we utilized their protocol because it was a protocol that had been tested and it worked. And so we thought, great, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, let's use that. And that protocol focused on breeding timing, which for our area meant that we were doing protocol testing, looking for birds between mid-April and mid-May. And that was the breeding time. Okay, well, that's good. We want to know if they're breeding on the preserves. Let's do that, and let's focus on that. So we did that for a year, and we had some volunteers go out and help us, and we had some staff doing it, and we went out and looked, listened for the birds and displays and all of that stuff in this time frame. And these were our results. Wah, wah. We got 0 birds. So then we took a step back and said, well, so we know they're here. I mean, we've heard them and seen them at Crossways. We've seen them at Armand Trout. So like, okay, this protocol is great for doing breeding stuff, and while we'd love to confirm breeding birds on our properties, we know they're using it during migration, which for our purposes of land management, using it for migration is just as important as using it for breeding. We want to make sure that we keep habitat appropriate for them to use during that early display time, that they have areas to feed in, all of those kinds of things, the things I talked about earlier, softening the forest edges so that they have some cover, in areas that would be appropriate for them. So all of those kinds of things. So we thought, okay, in 2020, let's back this up, and we still want to try to confirm breeding birds, but let's actually include the migration time as well, so that we get a sense of how many birds are using these properties during migration. So we said, great, we'll do migration surveys in March of 2020. And we all know how March of 2020 turned out. And all of our surveys were canceled because we didn't put volunteers in the field in March of 2020. And so, yeah, that didn't help us collect any data. So 2021 is really the first year that we have any data for, but yay, we had birds. So the orange bars here are Crossways, and you can see definitely that was the preserve that has the most birds. I do have to mention though, some of these other preserves didn't necessarily have the same amount of monitoring that Crossways did. So it may be a little bit comparing apples to oranges. Again, as I said, weather dependencies indicate when the birds are going to be most active, and we might not have had people out there at the optimum times. And so you can see this is, a bunch of coverage. It's at least once a week for 4 to 5 weeks at 4 different preserves, trying to get people out there listening and counting. And ideally, more than once a week would be great because, migratory paths of birds and migratory waves of birds happen on weather fronts a lot. And so, you could be out there on Monday and there's nothing. And then the proper weather front comes through for migration. And on Wednesday, there could be a dozen birds there. But if we're not counting, we don't know that. So this is an area that we definitely could use more volunteers and, have multiple people assigned to a preserve, for example. But yay, we got birds. So we're confident that we're moving in the right direction, and hopefully we'll get even more data for 2022. So that's exciting. And definitely Crossways is a key property. But I'd be really curious to explore some of these other ones in a little bit more depth because, again, like I said, I think there's probably more birds using them than we realize. So that would be something to focus on for this year and future years. So you too can participate in this study. And I actually have a couple of different ways that you can do this. So essentially, this recording of this program tonight and being familiar with the pink sound and the display sound and understanding when you need to be out in the field is pretty much all you need to know. I have a data sheet that, collect the temperature and the time that you're out there and the date and all of those kinds of things and how many birds you hear or see. But it's basically you're going out and listening for those pink calls. That's the key thing to hear, to know that there's woodcock in the area that might be displaying. And that's really what we're focused on for the migration time because they are displaying during migration. So again, these 4 preserves, I have Crossways crossed off here because that's where I'm going to do the public programs. And so if you don't want to do this on your own, and I recognize that not everybody may just want to, go do this and say, oh yeah, I'll help. But you want a little bit more in the field training. We'll talk about that on the next slide. And that's all going to happen at Crossways. So I don't need as much help there, but the other 3 preserves certainly need some help. And so again, that migrant time is really important, but we'd like to kind of take it through the breeding time as well. If we can have enough volunteers to help us out, just on the off chance that maybe we'll get some late calling birds. And if they fall in this time frame, then we can actually confirm breeding. So one question that I have, and I continue to follow some of the research that some other researchers are doing, is are climate changes relative to migratory timing impacting these birds? And it is quite possible that since we're seeing warming winters and we live right on the edge of an area where birds might be spending the entire winter, like the Delaware Bay shore of New Jersey and Delaware and Maryland and into Virginia, that we're seeing migrants go through really early, and they may not be hanging here to breed, or they're done displaying. We don't really know. So it's hard for us to confirm breeding. But again, if we can get the migrants, that's a definite step in helping us understand that we're managing the properties right for these birds. They are a species of concern. They're not like imminently going to go extinct in the near future. But as I said, they're losing habitat. So that's one specific area of concern. So anything that we can do to confirm that we have them is awesome and help with that. And the other reason why we're doing this is we like to try to link our community science projects to larger national or regional efforts that are going on. So like, for example, all of our monarch work, that's work that happens at a national level, and we're supplying data to researchers for that. And there are a couple of researchers that are doing woodcock work now. And they're actually researchers that are able to put radio transmitters on the birds, and they're trying to understand their migration better. And what I'm hoping to be able to do is to develop enough data on knowing how many migrating birds we have through here to be able to reach out to them and say, hey, if you're looking for another site or two to put radio transmitters on some of these birds to understand their migratory pathways a little bit more, consider us. Here's the data that I have on the birds that are using our area. And I'm hoping that by having that data, maybe I can interest them. And so we can sort of get incorporated into a larger regional study that's going on to help understand woodcock a little bit better, which would be awesome. But I need data to do that. So that's what we're trying to collect. And as I said, weekly is the minimum. If we could have enough people to help to have, 2 people out there, one on consistently, basically on either Monday and Tuesday and one on Thursday and Friday, that would be even better because, they are weather dependent and they're migration dependent. And so it can vary a lot day to day. And it's really about listening, roughly, depending on when you get there, about 15 to 30 minutes that you might have to spend each evening. And none of the sites are very hard to get to either. So all the preserves, where they would be calling from is very close to where you would park, if that's of interest to folks. And if you are interested in participating in this, on your own, please reach out to me via email, because like I said, this is basically the training, and I can send you the data sheet, which is pretty straightforward in terms of the data that we're collecting, and sort of talk you through that. So I'm happy to do that. But if you don't want to go out on your own right now, every Tuesday in March, I will be going to Crossways, and this will be part of our community science. So if you come out and do this with me, I'm counting you as a community science volunteer for this year. So please come join me. The idea behind this is I've got it scheduled for every Tuesday in March. And if we have bad weather that we'll have to cancel it on the Tuesday, I'm automatically moving it to Wednesday of that day. So I've kind of built in that rain, snow, too cold, too windy kind of time frame, so that we make sure we get out there for at least once a week at Crossways for the month of March. And yes, so that's what it's going to be. March 1st and March 8th are before we change the clock, so that's at 6 p.m. And then March 15th and the 22nd are after we change the clock, so it moves back to 7 p.m. And wear warm waterproof shoes. As I said, we don't walk very far from the parking lot, but it can get chilly standing out there at dusk. Feel free to bring, a portable chair with you, because we are literally pretty much going and standing in one spot. And the stiller that we can be, the more likely that birds will come out and display, and we're not going to disturb them. So absolutely feel free to bring a chair. Bring your binoculars. Sometimes they come out when there is enough light and we can actually see them up in the sky. And sometimes we see owls and hear owls as well. So, if that's another sort of, I want to see an owl, come join us. You can register for this on our website, and it's free registration. I'm just wanting to keep track of people that are coming for a given night. And the reason is because if I have to postpone it, I will let any registrants for a given night know at least a few hours before. I'll make a call about whether we're going to move it to Wednesday. And so if you want to be notified, you need to be registered. Feel free to register for more than one night if you would like to as well. You don't just have to come once. If you want to come for all 4 nights or just a couple, if you can, that's fine as well. So come join us that way. And that's really all I have on woodcocks tonight. So I'm happy to answer some questions. I'm going to swip to the last slide here, where so you can see some of the upcoming events. As I said, there's a community science overview next Tuesday that I'm doing for Ambler Library, and you can sign up directly on their website. March 3rd, there's a program. We have a guest speaker from the Philadelphia Mycology Club who's coming to talk about an introduction to mushroom hunting, which I am very much looking forward to. We already have about 40 people registered for that, so it should be a good program. We are having our Maple Sugar Festival this year after having to take last year off. So it's funny because maple sugar was sort of the last thing that we got in before everything shut down in 2020. So it's really fun to know that we're bringing it back. However, if you are familiar with our Maple Sugar Festival, we are not doing it at our headquarters barn in Ambler. We are doing it at Penland Woods. All the information is on the website, so you can find it. We weren't sure when renovations were going to start at the barn, and so we had to make some decisions a couple months back, and so it's going to be at Penland Woods for this year. I'm doing Nature Photography 101, a virtual program in March, and then we're starting our mill open houses again in April. It's a great opportunity to go see a historical grist mill in action. If you've never been there, it can be a really fun day. So again, all the information's on our website, and we will be continuing to add. I'm still working on a couple of additional guest speakers for this spring, and filling in with some hikes and things like that as well. So lots of things coming up, full back into virtual programs still going on for stuff like this, but definitely a lot of things back in person as well. So I encourage you to come join us. And I'm happy if anybody has any questions, let me know. You can unmute yourself if you want, or you can type it into the chat. It's entirely up to you.
I have a question. So the best place to see the displays is field edges, is that correct?
Yeah, so
And is it like, go ahead.
at Crossways where we do, if you're familiar with Crossways at all, there's sort of a path that goes through the middle of a field, and the woods would be on your left if you're walking away from the parking lot. And we kind of plant ourselves on that path. So we have a field in between us and the wood edge. And that's usually the best place to see them. All the places that I've seen them where I've gone to view them in other areas, that's kind of where you're at. You're at one edge of the field, if you will, and you have a field between you and the woods, because they're typically going to come out of the woods into that open area and launch themselves for their display. And so usually when they get high enough above whatever tree line is there, that's when you start to see them in the sky. You can't often see them when they're against the trees because they're small and brown and cryptic, but when they get up high enough, you can actually see them in the air. Yes, the female does look the same as the male, exactly. So other than actually seeing a painting bird, it's really hard to tell them apart. Or if you happen to see a female that has babies, if you got that lucky. And I will say, for anybody that wants to, explore a little bit, at Crossways Preserve, if you're not familiar with it, so from the parking lot, you kind of have two paths you can go. You can go left into the woods, which is sort of a gravelly kind of a trail. It kind of wraps around through there. Or you can kind of go sort of straighter to the right. That's the trail out into the woods. And that's where we will go watch them from at these walks. If you were going to go out there to monitor, that's where I would tell you to go stand. But if you take a walk at dawn or dusk on a non-monitoring day in, spring, early summer, the side of Crossways by the parking lot, there's kind of a cut through trail. And it's mostly used by horses. A lot of people don't even realize it's there. That is the trail we flush woodcock from routinely. But that's that, you put your foot down and there's this bird flying away from you. But give it a try, you might get lucky. Someday I'm just going to go sit there for hours to see if I can watch one walk across the trail. That is like the place with the highest likelihood of actually being able to see one like on the ground feeding. But again, like I said, it's just chance. Like it's, they take off from under your feet, literally. So. If anybody has any more questions, I'm happy to stay on for a couple of minutes. And if not, I want to say thank you for joining tonight. Hopefully you learned something. And hopefully I will see some of you at Crossways, or, maybe you're inspired enough to go out on your own and try to find them. I highly encourage it if you can. And that's all I have for tonight. So thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you in another program. Have a
I
good
have
night.
one more quick question.
Oh, sure.
So mating and nesting, they don't necessarily happen in the same place? Like, is that so just because you see like the displays in one area, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll have nesting birds in that area?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and not one that I've been able to get a good answer on. So in theory, they should happen in the same place. Like, so the males should be displaying, there should be females there, they mate with the females, and the females are going to stay there for a nest. But it is possible that the females also continue to migrate after that mating and find a nest someplace else. And so it's a little unclear even to me that we completely understand how that happens. That's why I think there are probably breeding birds there, maybe not a lot on any given property, but there's probably a few that are staying there and mated with some migrating male and, are raising young there. But when you're looking for a bird that's, a foot long, it's hard to find them. And, you think 60 acres isn't that big, but it really is. So, oh yeah, I saw another question come in. Oh, the best place to look at Crossways. Okay, so I should have put a map in. From the parking lot, if you kind of take the path straight out into the field, that's the best place to sort of listen for their displays. There's a gas pipeline that runs through the middle of Crossways, and that's usually where we go sit, is where that gas pipeline runs through, because that area is, the grass is cut lower. And so we usually sit on the trail right at the pipeline cut and face the woods. And that's usually where they'll come out. And we've had them on both sides, from the woods on the right and the left, at various times. But if you wanted to try to flush one in person, the best place is to go from the parking lot to the left on the gravelly trail. And you'll come to a spot that has, like, it's the first sort of little concrete bridge that's been put in there. And there's a trail that goes off to your right, and it's kind of like this diagonal trail through the woods. And that's the place that we've actually flushed them several times, when we've walked through there for surveys for other birds. So that's a place I'd suggest checking out if you're, really want to try to see one in person. I make no promises, but that's the best place. So, any other questions? Awesome. Thank you for joining again. I really appreciate it, and hope to see you out in the field. Have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was great.